Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Kate Connell, and I'm going to be the presenter for our session on Keep In-Services Interesting. For those of you that are joining the call live, welcome. I'm excited to have the interaction, hopefully, with some questions as we go. I do invite you to pop any questions that you have in the chat of our Teams meeting, and I'll address those towards the end when we have some time left over there to talk through some different questions that have come up from the group. Throughout the call, I will have everybody muted, and like I said, we'll circle back to some questions as we go. I'll be moving pretty quickly through this particular presentation. I have about 50 slides, and I want to give you lots of different ideas depending on where you are in your in-service journey. If you are brand new to developing in-services, if you are bringing some ideas back to maybe someone else who is mostly designing the in-services, or if you're super seasoned and you've run hundreds of in-services after dozens of years in the field, hopefully there's something here for you about keeping your team engaged and bringing in some different concepts and ideas. So just a quick little blurb about me before we get started. My name, like I said, is Kate, and I work at HydroApps. We're a digital documentation solution company, and we provide risk management software to the aquatics industry. Some of you on this call are clients of ours, and it's great to see you. And then some of you are potentially using some type of solution that you've DIY'd or another product in the market. And of course, this all comes back to risk management and making sure that our team is prepped and ready to respond most effectively to their situation, whether that's something that's happening in the water or on the deck. And so with this session today, we'll talk through some different ideas to make sure our teams are trained and ready to go. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll have my contact information, and we'll also have a workbook that we'll send out with the recording. So we know it's April, and if you're joining live, it's busy, it's go time. So if you need to jump off early, know that we'll get the recording to you. And then we'll also have a workbook that will have some expanded activities and scenarios in it. So anything that I talk through, if it doesn't sound like you fully understand the idea or the way to implement it, then you can either pop a comment in the comment, you can send me an email, or it might be in that workbook that we're going to send as well. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. Our agenda for today is going to be talking through realism. So how do we make our in-services be as realistic as possible so that our team isn't surprised for the first time when it happens, and it's urgent and it's essential that they respond with all of the information that maybe we haven't let them know. But then on the other side of that, how do we make sure that our practice is as realistic as possible so that if there is an incident of some kind, our team doesn't have a really hard time processing that, in addition to whatever other reasons they might be having a difficult time processing a emergency situation because they didn't even know it was possible for it to exist. So we'll talk a little bit about some ideas of bringing realism into the fold in your in-service trainings. Next, we'll talk about inclusion. So we'll talk about different considerations that we can be keeping in mind when we're designing our in-services, and then when we're also including different types of activities and flow into our practice. We'll talk about engagement, which if you've been doing this, more than once or twice, you definitely know that one of the things that we need to often revisit with our team over and over again is their ability to stay focused and stay on task, and to make sure not that we're just designing in services that we think are interesting, but that they're really landing with our team, and also that they're keeping us fresh and inspired, because after so many seasons, so many years, we all know what it can be like to feel kind of burnout and stale on the same topics. Our staff rotates, but a lot of times the content is consistent and the training curriculum is consistent. So how do we bring in some fresh ideas and fresh perspectives to keep things interesting, but then also make sure that everything's grounded in the most important things, the most likely to happen things, not just these kind of one-off specialty things. We can't spend all of our time there. So how do we find that balance? And then lastly, how do we put it all together? So ideas are great, but it's really the activation of those ideas. It's really the implementation of those ideas. So my goal with sessions is always to try to give you some ideas, but then also try to round really ground that back in reality and make sure that it's something that you're able to do. Even if it's a teeny tiny bite-sized thing that you're able to do this summer, that's a win. Even if it's just being able to store the slides aside and revisit it when time allows in your schedule, depending on what your season or your annual cycle looks like, then that's definitely a win. So let's talk a little bit about our first topic, which is realism. So we tend to think a lot about practice, and it's really topical because there was just kind of a thread online this week on social media about the difference between certifications and trainings. And if you've been to sessions of mine, I talk a lot about diversity and inclusion in general. That's kind of where my heart and my passion is on education. But I also like to talk about what the realistic and repeatable processes look like to be able to pull these types of things off. And when it comes to realism, we have this conversation between certified and trained and how these are different. So staff needs to be certified, but then they also need to be trained. And certification implies that they'll do something once and then we check off that they've done it. But it doesn't mean that they've maintained the skills that they were tested on. And it definitely doesn't mean that they're trained to the specific standards of our location or locations or the different components. So realism in our context, there's lots of options and lots of ideas that might not necessarily be on this list, but to get us started, it's not necessarily using dry equipment or having these step-by-step prompts that are setting our team up to know exactly what's coming next. And it's also not pausing for that feedback by having staff look at us to say, are they unconscious? Are they breathing? Do they have a pulse? And then getting an answer. A lot of times our practice does look like that. And that's to be expected. We do need some of that, but we also need ways for staff to start to read context clues and to practice not getting prompts back and not having that step-by-step feedback that our managers might be used to giving them before they continue through that scenario or continue through that assessment. And then also not seamless rescues, right? So all of us, regardless of if we've been doing this for, a year or 25 years, we have that kind of contingency plan in the back of our head of those times that things haven't gone according to plan, and that happens more often than a really seamless, perfect rescue. There's some part of the plan that doesn't go according to how it's supposed to, either in your EAP or in your practice or in your certification, or even in kind of that orientation of how you've reviewed it. So making sure that there's room for that practice and that growth is really essential. Realistic practice does, though, look like making sure that you're replicating things on deck and in and around the water that could happen and even more so that are likely to happen. So we know that vomit and foam and blood happens when there are removals from water. We know that someone's airway, if they're around water or in water, is going to be wet, and that's going to be different than a dry person that we're rendering care to. Obviously, our team is going to be trained to do both, and they're going to practice both, working on people who are dry and people who are wet, but making sure that we're moving through the motions of all of these parts, which includes removing the actual clothing when we're giving, when we're administering shocks with an AED and reading their body and things along those lines, and not just talking through what those adjustments would look like and just saying out loud, here's how we would adjust this, or here's how we would do it if it was real, but actually going through the motions. Realism also looks like miscommunication and delayed recognition at times. It also can look like filling in different links of the communication chain. It can look like all types of things from, small missteps to big ones. And there's ways to layer that into the training so that we work through it and we problem solve and we build that soft skill of problem solving, which all of us want our teams to have more of, but also that we can walk through and talk through some of these unique situations. So hopefully by now, some of these ideas with using real equipment and using trainers that are accurate, trainer versions of the actual real equipment that and brand types that you use is pretty common knowledge. But if it's not something that you're doing right now or you're not able to prioritize, making sure that your training equipment is the same trainer for the brand AED that you use, and you're actually using the BVMs, and you have a training set that are labeled training, and an actual first aid kit that is the exact same crash bag that you would grab, and it has the exact same components in it in the same spots, then that's something that's relatively low hanging fruit from a budgetary perspective, to be able to do. Obviously, trainers are expensive. So if you have a set that are not identical and not the same ones now, that's something you can budget for in the future. But do make sure that you're actually using whatever equipment that you also have. That tends to be something that I think a lot of us that are training staff kind of at this higher level where we're certifying and we're training staff, and we might be certifying and training other people's staff. This seems like a no-brainer. But for some of us that are maybe working more seasonally, or we might even be taking over pool operations, and our main gig, if you will, might be programming, and we're taking care of youth sports, and we're taking care of facility management and things along those lines. That might be something that you haven't heard yet, so I just want to make sure we mention it. We also want to be hopefully already adding layers of distraction and noise, and we want to be using live actors in our actual training opportunities, both people that are on our team and outside of our team. So if you're just using mannequins right now and you're not utilizing real humans and having your team practice in a variety of different situations on real people, that would be the task at hand. And again, that's something that requires some preparation and some training, but it's not something that would require any change to your budget. And then lastly, another best practice, hopefully we're all thinking about already, is running full EAP scenarios from the beginning all the way to the end, and making sure that there's some type of opportunity to practice, or at a minimum discuss what post-care response looks like. So ideally, you're utilizing whatever additional first responders will be on scene and will take over and transfer care, and you're doing some type of scenario, some type of joint training with those folks. So here's a quick framework. If you've done any training with me in the past, you know I love an acronym. I love a kind of replicatable, different word or phrase thing that we can use. So one of the things you can think about when it comes to realistic training is this framework here. So can you replicate the environment as accurately as possible? Which means that you need to be doing training in your actual facility, and you need to make sure that you're doing it in all the facilities that staff will be working at, in and under all of the conditions that are possible. So you need to be simulating environments when it is light out, when it's dark out, when it is chaotic, when it is quiet, and that you're being really aware of what that would look like. Hopefully you're taking documentation of some kind of when your incidents are happening, and that's allowing you to get some really good data about your facilities and about your response. So you know which facilities are having the most responses to, you're providing the most care at. You know what time of day trends are happening. You know, you can pull different information around weather. You know what the most common response is that you're doing, if it's an active rescue likely. So you're able to find that information from your documentation, hopefully, and you're able to go back and make some decisions around training and around how you would replicate that environment. You also want to have that equipment accuracy. So I already mentioned using real equipment, but then also making sure that you're not pretending to set things up. You're actually setting up bag valve masks. You're actually utilizing all of the resources and all of the equipment that you have. I live in the state of Iowa here in the U.S. I know we have some friends on that are outside of the U.S., but it's not a super populated state, and so we do have a lot of seasonal pools, and we have a lot of folks who are running those pools just part-time, or potentially for the first time, and their highest level of experience is that maybe they were a guard there the summer before. So often I do see people for recertifications that have only seen a bag valve mask in their certification and never in their training. And so it's just something to remember that we have various levels of training happening in our industry. And if it's not something that, especially at some of those higher levels in those year-round levels and those more certified RAN levels that you're doing, that you need to be definitely doing that. And I'm sure you're hearing the same thing from your certification agencies when you're getting initially certified and recertified. The A is adding some human factors, and I'll talk through a few more of these as we go. But one of the things that you can predict when it comes to people is that they're unpredictable. So we know that various different things are going to show up when it comes to response and actual emergencies. So we need to simulate a lot of that as much as we can during our trainings. We need to simulate what it's like when someone is trying to interact with the situation that doesn't necessarily know what they're doing or where our equipment is or what the situation is at hand. We need to simulate hesitating and freezing and knowing that that's not a personal failing, but that's the body or the brain, excuse me's way of trying to protect our first responders potentially from something that's not supposed to happen, right? Their brain is not supposed to see someone not moving in the water. It's supposed to see someone moving all the time in the water because that's generally what they see when they're scanning. We need to talk about fatigue. We need to talk about adrenaline. And then with the L, we need to be layering in different levels of complexity. So one of the things that I think is the hardest to kind of get our brain sometimes wrapped around as an industry is that it's this and situation. We need to teach our team the foundations, and then we need to layer in some complexity. And I know that a lot of us don't have a ton of time with our team, and that's definitely a limitation. But finding ways to make sure that they have those basics and then we're layering in complexity is really essential. Obviously, we need to keep those together as that and implies that we're not just working on foundational things, we're not just layering in complexity. So that's definitely something we want to keep in mind. When it comes to training, we tend to think about kind of moving through response on cues. We're using plastic or rubber objects instead of an actual person. And things tend to be pretty contained, even though it's practice and it might feel more high stress or it might feel more kind of on point for our team, especially some of the younger adults on our team. But it's still overwhelmingly a predictable situation that they know to expect. So much to the point that at times we're saying things like, okay, we're going to do a submerge passive. Who wants to go next? And we're kind of calling these things out. So as much as possible, we want to make sure that our team is grounded in the reality that situations can run smoothly. Our team can know exactly what to do at certain times, but it also can be chaotic and wet, and there can be hesitation and body fluids, which is something we need to think about. So let's talk about some of the specific areas of realism that I think we can be bringing into our in-services to keep them interesting, but obviously to also keep them realistic. So we can be talking about wet airways, and I've already mentioned this a little bit, and the idea that mannequins can be wet, and we can simulate that with like using something like aloe to simulate what it would be like when a mask is really sliding around and it's hard for us to make that seal. We also can be using different simulated ideas around actual real live actors. If you've taken any sessions with Kelly Martinez at the City of Phoenix, you know that the city has come up with some ideas, or Kelly at the city has come up with some ideas around replicating foam. We were lucky enough to do a session together at AOAP where we had an entire station talking about how to replicate foam with mannequins. And you can certainly do that, but you also can replicate foam and fluid from someone's mouth that's a live actor with stuff that wouldn't injure them, obviously. And we'll have some resources for that at the end as well and part of the workbook. But how do we handle having these conversations with staff and making sure that they're aware that they might need to be giving wet ventilations in the actual pool and practicing that? Do we have equipment like the water safety product, big easy simulators that allow us to actually give and replicate what it would be like to give breaths on a live actor without actually pushing those ventilations through a resuscitation mask and into a person? And is that something that we're bringing into the fold of our practice and we're having conversations ideally first with our team about, but then we're also simulating that practice as well? And then are we actually moving through the motion of real timing and breaths and compressions? We tend to move really quickly through a lot of our practice, and our team does this too, right? Has anybody ever been in that situation where you're teaching a class and everyone does the skill, and then by the time you get through the first or second pairing or small group, everybody else has already kind of released the scene of what they were doing. So if they had some type of head hold, or if they were doing something specific, like it was a physical rescue in the water, they've then released each other from whatever we were going to evaluate, and we have to have them do it again. So same idea here is we kind of move through the motions really quickly, and we need to simulate that things can be really slow, and it can take so much more time than we expect to get the backup care that might be coming from the front desk or might be coming from EMS that we've summoned. And it can be very situational as well. You might be in a situation where you have a lot of people around that can help. You might be in a situation where it's few and far between, and it's kind of those when something wrong can happen. Like the most unexpected time is when it happens, and someone's off doing something else, or there's a reason there's a delay. And there's also the time warping that happens in a high stress situation. So making sure that we talk through that timing is really important. Here's a little bit of information on thinking about when you're using the actual airway management and AED use with a live actor. You want to be thinking about how you let your team practice pulse check and breath check on a real person. It's possible they've never done this before, aside from that first certification class, if they even practiced it on a real person. Hopefully they did, but if you weren't there, you don't necessarily know. And also, one of the things I have found is that it can be really awkward for people in training to actually like breathe with someone that close to their face, and they can sometimes hold their breath and things, and that can manipulate the experience of checking for someone's actual breathing and seeing what that would look like on someone who's actually breathing. So just being mindful of that, letting your team know that that's something that you're going to practice, so that they can also be mentally prepared for that. That might seem like a funny thing to feel a little bit worked up about, but I guarantee you that you've had people on your team that have been like, oh my God, I don't want to breathe. That feels so awkward. I feel weird every time the doctor asks me to take a deep breath. I'm like, do I know how to take a deep breath? I think I get worked up about it. I'm like, can I actually take a full and deep breath? So we know some of our younger team members definitely are feeling awkward and funny around some of that stuff. Making sure that we're doing ventilations on a real human. So like I said, there's products out there that are relatively inexpensive compared to some other things like AED trainers and mannequins that you can use to simulate this, and we'll share that product as well. We gave a ton of them out at the AOAP conference, and we just think it's Kelly and I really wanted to share that tool because we think it's a really good tool, and there's there's not as much innovation of product as there definitely could be with some of these topics. So it's exciting when we do have something along those lines. Understanding what agonal breathing and just different type of labored breathing is like on a real human, and not expecting it to be black and white. And then obviously simulating the real use of an AED, which includes, of course, all of the things that we think about in a certification class, like drying them off and attaching the pads, but it also would include removing potentially a upper body clothing or a bathing suit if someone has that on. And if it's the first time that your team has even comprehended the idea that they might have need to be giving care to someone with their breasts exposed and they need to cut open a suit, then that's definitely something that we haven't prepared them for enough if that's happening. So make sure that you're actually practicing this, and you're actually finding some clothing and bathing suits that you can cut off. One of my favorite tips for this is I'm in free groups in my area, but I'm also in a lot of mom groups. Kind of a exciting thing about being a mom is there's all these mom Facebook groups, and you can find lifeguards in them, and you also can find bathing suits that no longer fit people's children that might not be wear appropriate, like they're just something's wrong with them, or they're kind of thinning out in certain areas. People have nothing to do with them. So instead of throwing them away, you can do a little drive for clothing and bathing suits, and then not feel bad about having your team practice actually cutting those off. Overall, with the skills, we're talking about making sure that we can recognize agonal breath, our breath delivery is effective, and that we're also making sure that we're practicing on a variety of bodies. When you're practicing with your team and you're using live actors, you're only going to have as much diversity as you have on your team, and that might be kind of limited just by kind of the way that your team is staffed. So if you have a lot of young people versus if you employ full-time people, you're going to have a different demographic of staff. But being mindful, and we'll talk more about this in the inclusion section, that you can have different sizes of mannequins. And then obviously here you can simulate some different things with adding a DIY sports bra and adding some items to the bra to simulate having compressions be done on a body with breast tissue. But you also can have conversations around this with your team too, and kind of take out those kind of ew or wow or surprise factors that can come up when we're having conversations around these different topics. Okay, so let's talk. We have a couple more slides here, and then we're going to move into the inclusion. But let's talk a little bit about just when it comes to water in general. We tend to have this perception that shallow water means that it's more safe water, but shallow water is deep water for someone. I always make the joke that I'm 5 feet tall, so shorter water can be dangerous even for some adults, depending on their size and their skill level. We also want to make sure our team is just aware that there's different distortions that happen to water. And I know this sounds pretty straightforward, but I have to admit that when I was working in the field as an aquatic supervisor, I was really good at drilling my team on things related to like first aid and CPR, but we didn't do a whole lot of training about scanning and recognition. And there were a lot of things that we mentioned in certification classes that I didn't feel like I had a really clear playbook of how to bring up into trainings. And so that's part of my hope with this session too, is you can think about how you could implement some of these things into your training that maybe you don't have a really clear spelled out plan for yet. You also can be thinking about objects looking different from a different variety of reasons. And I'm realizing now that it's a secondary drowning in here, and that isn't a term that is used. So omit that from that it was even on here. Just pretend like you didn't even see it. There's 50 slides, and I apparently didn't go through them with enough awareness. I know that some of this was taken from the session that Kelly and I did at AOAP, and that was something that we did take out. So apologies for that being on there. This is my little don't do as I do, but do try to just be mindful that when we're teaching our team, that when we make mistakes, we are learning the best next language to use, and that we're educating ourselves as well about the correct drowning terminology. And as aquatic professionals, that we're just constantly learning about what that is and making sure that we're not kind of stuck in some old terminology or old pathways there. So it's a great example of humility on my end for including that and just reminding all of us to do better. Moulage and bodily fluid response. So just a couple of things here. Bleeding, wounds, and body fluids are likely to come up in a situation. So you can replicate those and make it fun and more creative with your team by bringing in different skill work as far as what they're able to do. Some people do this seasonally and bring in different things, different times of year, and use different things they find, especially around Halloween. And I know on the HydroApps blog, we have several different posts with some different ideas about things you can pick up during Halloween season, but also the rest of the year, of how you simulate what type of care is needed based on different types of moulage use and bodily fluid response. I find that the camp industry and also like the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts have some really good resources on moulage because they take wilderness first aid. And so there's some really great resources about that as well. And I'll make sure we include those, but we also give you some ideas around how to get started with using moulage. If you were at the AOAP conference, hopefully you had a chance to give that a try. And sometimes getting messy is exactly what your team needs to stay engaged, and it helps them feel like they're tactily involved and they're physically able to do some stuff with the different items. But it also is just a different way to engage them and might be more in line also with the ways that they're used to learning. Learning's evolved so much since even I was in school. I have a fourth grader, and even just learning about how he's learning, it's really a lot different than just sitting in a desk and kind of that push and pull model that so many of us are used to. Here's another acronym because I love them. For human factors, be thinking about how you can implement practice around hesitation, knowing that emotional response is going to really vary, and it's going to vary based on different people's responses and different personalities. Adrenaline is likely to be something that comes into play. There can always be instances of role confusion where people have practiced it a certain way, and then when it's realistic, they maybe didn't have that specific role. So it's important that you also are letting people practice different things. If you always practice that, a manager or a head guard or a pool coordinator is the one that calls EMS, because that's what the structure looks like at your outdoor pool during your busiest times, then you're not necessarily simulating what it looks like when it's early morning swim and it's just lap swim and swim team and there's only 3 lifeguards and none of them are a head guard. Then there's that kind of disconnect of what are they supposed to do when there's just the 3 of them, and how do you make sure that they don't have that role confusion when it's real as well. And then tunnel vision, how do you work with your team to make sure that they are able to stay on task with whatever their specific assignment is, but also know that there's a lot of other things going on and that it's instrumental that everybody is responsible for their own parts of the puzzle, but you also sometimes need another person to be able to check in on others, and see what's going on holistically and give that feedback. When it comes to emotional dysregulation, if you are familiar with some of the work that ILSERA, or the International Lifeguard Critical Incident Response Alliance, is doing, I'm lucky enough to be a volunteer for them, and we've done some different training on de-escalation and regulation, and just having conversations and working through practices with our team about all of the things that are normal and to be expected. So our team likely will be unsure of what's going on. They will be uncomfortable. They will maybe need to do some breathing exercises during or after. They may need to click into being able to have that verbal self-talk and be able to kind of slow things down as a regulation tool and as a way of also making sure that everyone else is able to stay present and not having these hesitations or not kind of zoning out and then not being able to give care. It's a disservice if we don't at least talk about what can happen in the case of an emergency and a response situation. But it's also really good to add these layers into training. And again, it makes it interesting and it makes it normalized, which is one of the biggest things that I think we have the possibility to do with our teams, especially of our part-time teams and our younger teams, of normalizing some of this and not suggesting that they just need to tough it out and that it's, any reaction outside of kind of a typical response is a wrong response, but knowing that all of this is normal and typical and to be expected, certainly as well. So as we wrap up this portion, just thinking about realism kind of holistically as the why behind why we want to be including things into our practice that help our team be more prepared for a real response includes the fact that, as we said, humans are predictably unpredictable. So we know that any situation that they're having to vary from what they normally do with scanning the water is going to potentially lead to them having some additional stress. We know that traditional drills might be really good for time on task, and I'll talk about that as we get into some of the gamification stuff and the engagement. But we also want to make sure that we're layering in components that are realistic and are actually kind of pushing them towards growth when it comes to their own confidence and what they know how to do and what they can respond to, and that we're also pushing some growth around the soft skills of curiosity, confidence, decision-making, emotional regulation. These are all really essential things for lifeguards to have, but they're also things that aren't necessarily taught as just like a basic check the box, this is the skill, and we hope that you can all of a sudden be confident. This comes from the practice of including these things into our practice. We can also add in simulation tools to help bridge the gap. So sensory components, anatomical elements, we'll talk about some of these in inclusion as well. And then just really thinking about the fact that what they're practicing is what they're going to be doing. And so making sure that you've layered in some of these opportunities for them to focus on this is really great. As part of the marketing for this workshop, we did promise some scenarios. So just a couple like high level things to think about. You can add in slippery airway practice with a guardian or parent yelling and then have it be timed in some capacity. You can work on a submerged victim with distractions of other people being in the water and causing, changes to the water, the top of the water, and also your distraction and attention being pulled in different directions. You can do wet deck and a clothing removal type of scenario or challenge. Really, the idea here is to find some ways to layer in some different layers of scenarios. And I have a little chart here at the end that I'll take us through for some different ideas of how to layer in some different topics. Just a couple things to wrap up here. Items and practice kits should be identical to the real ones. We already mentioned that. Your practice kits should model and be the same as your emergency kits, so people know what they're going to have in that bag, what's going to be at their disposal, and where to find it. You should always use stuff as it's designed to be used. That seems pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised at, different things like different sized bag valve masks, using different types of resuscitation masks and things like that. So just being mindful that people are using things appropriately and they're actually using them. So not just that they pull out the mask, but that we're actually going through the motions and doing everything, which is what this last point is here, is don't simulate or pretend. Things should be assembled and you should be using them as appropriate. Okay, let's shift gears here and talk about our second idea, or our second part of keeping in-services interesting, which has to do with inclusion. So not everyone is going to experience care the same way. There's a variety of reasons why someone may have a different experience when we are rendering them care, and that can be based on their own identity, or it can be based on the situation that is at hand. Different people based on their gender, their body size, their body capabilities, if they have a disability, whether that's something that's visual to you or not, that can make a difference. If they are speaking some or none of the language that might be the language that you're speaking as the responder, that can impact and create a barrier. There's different cultural norms around water and access to water, and then subsequently around different ways to receive care and what that looks like. Obviously, neurodiversity is also a topic that's really front and center right now. So just knowing that anybody who is that's brain is different and it's not doesn't function as a typical brain, is neurodivergent in their identity. And neurodiversity is everybody, so every brain's diverse, but neurodivergent means that someone has a brain or has a condition where their brain varies from what the typical brain or the neurotypical brain is. And so because of that, their lens might be perceiving things that are true for them, but that might not be what other people are perceiving. And what is important to remember about every list that anybody gives you when it has to do with inclusion topics or diversity and inclusion as a whole is that none of this is a monolith. So no one person has the same experiences or the same situational experiences or awareness as the entirety of the group that they belong to. So someone that has ADHD that perceives a rescue a certain way isn't necessarily going to tell you that every single person who has ADHD is going to experience it the same way, but it can give us just some insights into what could be possible. And what's great about this is we don't always need to know exactly what's going on to be able to be receptive to the concept that different people need different things, and our care needs to be responsive to the situation and the person in the situation, and it doesn't always have to look the same. And then the last one on here is trauma responses. So people have trauma, and that's really something that generally we can't see from observing, but their different experiences, their different lived experiences can manifest in different ways. And so, someone hearing an air horn go off as an EAP is being activated might have a really visceral response to hearing such a loud noise, and react in a way that feels not in line with what is typical or what we've observed in the past. And that could be for a number of reasons, but one of them could be that it's a trauma response of some kind. And we, again, don't need to know what happened or what's going on in this person's before story to be able to just provide them the most compassionate care that we can. So what can go wrong? So bias or discomfort can lead to, as responders, us delaying care or not giving complete care, or most commonly, just not knowing what to do and then not doing anything for fear of doing the wrong thing, right? I know that as someone who speaks quite a bit about DEI topics, I regularly am worried about saying the wrong thing, but I know that as language changes and as things change. And I know that it's better to kind of move through the motions and do the most educated version of what I can, and knowing that things are going to evolve and change. And hopefully I'll have people that will also let me know, like, hey, this is, this was what you intended, and this is what, um, what you said or how you explained it, and here's some ideas, and having people that are able to do that. Same idea here is, I know we live in a culture where it can be difficult sometimes to respond wrong. And, we live in a time where people are held responsible and held accountable when they do the wrong thing. But I do still overwhelmingly want to suggest that we can add things into in-service that empowers our team to be as ready as possible. So the idea here is, shifting the mindset from everything is like just a set of steps that we have to do, or like an SOP or a process, to respond to the person in front of you and be able to pause long enough to like really see what's going on, and even be open to asking that person of what would be helpful for them. When it comes to an inclusive response, I like to think about the SAFER acronym. So just being sensitive to the fact that different people have different experiences, as best as you can, leading from an assumption-free mindset, and doing your best to name biases that you have, because we all have them. The brain is very binary. The brain is designed to think of things very black and white. And so we all have different biases from our own lived experiences, but also from just like the media and the news that we consume and the area that we've grown up in, and the lens of the guardians and the people who have raised us. So just being super mindful that we can be aware, and we can be super in the know about our own assumptions. And we might still have them, but we can kind of call them out in the moment and move through them and be aware of that. F is for flexible care. So always adapting and being willing to adapt position and approach, and making it as collaborative as possible. So one of the things that young people don't always know, or people that are, not used to kind of having these forward conversations, is that everybody that has, lived experience is going to feel like they are an expert in themselves. So what's great about that is, as you're trying to have your team provide care for someone, because we all feel like we're experts in ourselves, we generally, and again, this is an assumption, but you can start here and then kind of keep an open mind. You're able to ask people what would be the most helpful and supportive and productive as it goes for responsiveness. So you can ask them questions about, would it be more comfortable if you were in this position or that position? They're an expert in their own experience. And so you can give them opportunity to communicate with you about what would be ideal. And then with what they know about care, they're able to be responsive and kind of be creative and fill in the blanks with what they're able to do with the information that they've been given. You also want to encourage your team to engage and explain, so clear communication. The idea of like sports casting, where we're talking out loud about what we're doing, is huge. If you're a parent, you probably do quite a bit of sports casting. Like, okay, I'm putting on my shoes now, and then I'm going to head to the car. And that's, a tool that we can often use to let others know what we're doing and what our expectation is. And you can do this here as well as sportscasting everything that you're doing and what you're witnessing, and asking questions as well from there. And then respect people's autonomy. So like I said, people are the experts in their own of their own selves. And so using a culture of consent and then following people's leads is always a best practice. This is something that I encourage us to be teaching young people anyways, regardless of what their position is. I think front desk staff and youth sports staff, and even people that don't come in direct contact with other people's bodies, should still be learning about autonomy and consent, and building a culture around that, so that way they can be leading from that place. So what does this actually look like when we're talking about, body differences and inclusion? When it comes to body and anatomy, we can be thinking about talking with our team and having them practice CPR and compressions on bodies of different sizes, which that can include a body that a pregnant person, or that can include a large chest that has breast tissue, or not, depending on what that body looks like, but making sure that our team knows that they're going to need to adjust care. Most people that come to the pool don't have the same exact makeup as a mannequin, of a standard kind of mannequin that you would buy and see most popularized in our industry. So having conversations about how we adjust, if we're always only practicing on one size, sometimes there can be just some barriers to be thinking about that when it's real and on a person of a different size. You also want your team to be thinking about the fact that they might give care to someone with breast tissue, and there might be some hesitation around that and just some worry around that, because we know that breasts are sexualized in a way that's different than when it's just a chest. And so it's important that you have those conversations, because there is data that suggests that care is less readily available for people with breast tissue. So just a reminder about that. You also can talk with them and show them that different people have limb differences, and you might be providing care to someone that doesn't have a arm, whether that's due to something congenital that they were born with, or they might have had some type of like physical trauma to that part of their body. And that might cause hesitation in us if we're not thinking about it ahead of time, but it shouldn't be changing the way that we administer care, aside from needing to adapt to whatever we're finding in someone's physical body. If they're conscious, obviously, we also have the opportunity to have conversations with them about that as well. And then removing clothing, and just being aware of modesty in general. So for some people, modesty is tied to their culture and maybe even their religion. So it is important that we're just aware of that. With communication, it's always great to be thinking about how we're able to have conversations with our team, with folks who are not speaking the same language as us. Here, I'm assuming that most of you are speaking predominantly English at your work site, but some of you might be also speaking Spanish and French, and there's other languages as well. So just being aware that there can be communication obstacles when your team is trying to talk with someone that maybe they don't know the language as the person that they're trying to provide care for. And so you can practice that situation by working through gestures and tones, and also having some different visual aids available, and also having practice around how do we communicate as effectively as possible, even under stress, and how do we make sure that we're talking clearly and we're being mindful of the different ways that our communication might be received as well. We can also be thinking about some different things around neurodivergent folks who might be visiting our facilities, and just being aware that neurodivergent is a huge umbrella. And so just like with like the disability umbrella, there can be, hundreds of different types of disabilities. Neurodivergent brains is still a developing topic, and they don't actually know all that much yet, but we do know that there's around a dozen different types of actual different diagnoses that can be under neurodivergent in that umbrella, but people can also self-diagnose as neurodivergent, and their experiences are going to be really different. We might need to be thinking about sensory input, and someone who might be overwhelmed visually or auditorily, and how we are able to help them process what we're trying to say. We might have people that aren't, that are kind of moving really quickly through the process, and instead of them being the one that needs us to slow, we might need to be slowing ourselves down to be able to help them regulate in that way. When it comes to trauma, different people can also have really strong responses based on their lived experience, and their brain can kind of short circuit towards certain emotions or certain expressions and behaviors that might seem either uncharacteristic, or they might seem really atypical of the situation. It might be one of those situations where you think to yourself, like, that's not how I would handle this. That is generally a read that someone is having a atypical response to something that is feeling maybe a lot bigger than it is to them, and that's for a variety of reasons. Be aware that people might not want to be making eye contact. That is something that, even with lifeguarding, that people are used to, people in professional, I'm using invisible air quotes right now, professional settings are used to people making eye contact. And that's, professionalism is a social construct anyway. We've made up what professionalism is and what it looks like. But it's important just to keep in mind for lifeguards. There's a lot of times where lifeguards aren't going to be making direct eye contact because they can't break their skin and it's inappropriate for them to do so. But there's also probably some instances where patrons are not going to be wanting to make eye contact either. And then building psychological safety during care, being able to protect people's identity and their own experience and dignity as much as possible is really essential. So here's a quick little formula you can use to build your own scenario. You really want your team to be thinking about their own self-awareness. So what might come up for them and starting from that point. And then this is a great opportunity for you to also get some feedback back from your team around where they're feeling like they might have some weaknesses or some areas they want to focus on or some blind spots and get some of that feedback. But essentially you want to be thinking about the guard and having their own bias and their own potential kind of dysregulation or concern around being watched or evaluated as a starting point. And then from there, you can stack on a response situation with some layer of inclusion. Doesn't have to be, you don't have to throw like the whole bag at them in one instance. You can definitely start with some more simple things or things that are most likely to happen, and then some type of complication. We get the best practice from what is happening at our facilities and around our facilities. So I really recommend that you find ways to also keep track of what type of instances are coming up, and you're able to rinse and repeat and use those as different types of practice opportunities and then learning opportunities for your team as well. All of the sensitivity training that I used to do when I was working at a municipality, all of the examples were pulled from things that really happened. And some of them were kind of embarrassing for us that we like kind of screwed up on some of them, and we had to learn how to do better on some of them. And some of them were like, I felt really proud of our response around some of them. And that's just part of it too, right? It's just learning and then having that cultural, internal culture of improvement and that growth mindset. So I do have a series of different ideas that you can pull into scenarios here. And this will be in the workbook with some additional direction. So I'll just go through it really quickly, but some ideas around identity, language, and representation, some different practice around a trans patron and bystander commentary, name mismatch situation when it comes to a rescue. And remember, all of these have to do with emergency response situations. Obviously, you could be doing a lot of this around customer service and things like that, and more soft skill related stuff. But because we're trying to keep in-services interesting, we want to be thinking about how we can layer these into actual practice. And then person with non-visible or a hidden disability. There's also environmental and access considerations. So someone that's using a mobility device of some kind and responding to that. If there's a service animal that's present, heat, illness, and someone who's fasting due to cultural or religious reasons, how do you handle that? Just kind of some ways to open up conversations around these things with your team. Mental and emotional health. So if they're having a panic attack, if there is a concern around self-harm, and it's an active situation, post-rescue emotional response, all of these are valid things to be practicing and discussing with your team. Bias awareness and assumptions. So, having different response to different types of patrons or patrons that you hear from a lot that maybe are coming up to you with lots of things over and over again. It's kind of like you stop listening to someone that's saying the same thing over and over again, and then it's a serious situation, you have to actually respond. Body size bias in rescues and how we navigate that, and then different levels of pain tolerance and how people are interpreting pain and how that can also shift how we provide care. And then this one has a few examples of communication barriers. So if there's limited availability for both groups to communicate to each other or both individuals to communicate to each other, if you have deaf or hard of hearing patrons, if you have someone who is neurodivergent, or you might not know that they're neurodivergent, but they're experiencing overwhelm or sensory overload. And then the last two here, we have consent and autonomy. So a teen minimizing their injury, maybe like in a group setting, a group with a traumatized, or a guest with trauma, excuse me, doesn't want to be touched in a certain way. And we're trying to provide them with some maybe first aid care or assessing them, how we approach that. Religious or cultural modesty concerns, we've talked a little bit about that, but how do we navigate that with our team? And then the last one here, power dynamics, and bystanders. So making sure that we just have different ways to practice escalation of a crowd, panic from folks who are on site, and then also interference with any type of authority figure. So a lot of times this is either an adult that it's minor responders that are interacting, or it can also be someone that says that they are more trained. So a doctor has suddenly appeared, or a nurse, or something along those lines. And how does our team work with that, and how do we layer that in? Okay, let's go through engagement. This is going to go a little bit longer than I expected, but that is okay. If you are going to be getting the recording and if you need to leave towards the end, we will get you the rest of it. But if you're able to stay on, please do. So part 3 is about engagement. So if your team's bored, they're not retaining that information. So we know through a series of just different studies and things that when we're using competition, when people are moving, when there's variety, they say variety is the spice of life, that keeps people being able to stay attentive. I also think that in our culture of like instant dopamine, where we're constantly being fed kind of new and exciting things, boredom has gone way up. I think my child tells me that they're bored usually like 10 to 12 times a day. And I know that that's not what it is. It's that they're not being super stimulated in that moment, right? So it's important for us to just know that that's part of the culture that we currently have, that our teams are expecting to constantly be stimulated because that's what they're getting from devices and from technology. And that means that we need to be focusing on, some things that really do pull them in, like recognition, making them feel rewarded, that kind of like reward loop where they do something good and they get rewarded. Even if it seems really, we're old school and it seems silly that we need to be rewarding every little thing, it really is powerful. Helping focus on decision making and giving them the confidence to read the room, literally read the pool, read the natatorium, and then be able to make decisions based on what they're observing and backing up those decisions. Even if we haven't gone through every single scenario, we're able to give them that context to be able to make those informed decisions. And then communication and teamwork. So the way that engagement works, gamification, which is what I'm going to talk about here in a moment, is really a process that's been involved in learning, and it's come forward in learning. If you use any apps on your phone, which I think most of us that have a smart device do at this point, or on your tablet, that that all the different apps gamify in different ways, right? There's ways to collect points, and there's ways to play games and apps that have nothing to do with game apps. And this is really the idea of getting people to be engaged and kind of looped into the cycle. So gamification is kind of the outside context, and on the inside, psychology is what kind of makes everything work and go together. It's not just about having fun, although it is fun and it is engaging, but it's also how we're now like wired. It's how our brain psychologically works, but then we're also seeing this over and over with gamification. So why does gamification work as engagement, and why do we see, our team be more engaged and more on task when we're focused on gamification? Well, first of all, they have autonomy. Who doesn't like having choice and having some ownership over that? It also gives them something that they can be working towards mastering. So you have some people on your team that are really motivated by being independent and having their own autonomy and don't like being told what to do. That works great for gamification. But then you also have people on your team that really care about how well they do at something, and they're competitive. And so they're going to really feed off of getting feedback and that competence factor. We've already talked a little bit about the reward loop, but behavior into reward, into repetition reinforces those positive behaviors that you want to see. And that's something that we integrate into training, but we also integrate it into the culture that we have at our workplace. Relatedness feeds into connection, so it helps people stay connected, ties back to their why. So there's a reason that they've decided to do lifeguarding. There's a reason that they're tied into aquatics. So this leans back on that and helps them feel like they have a shared identity and they're part of that in-group with the other folks that they work with, and then the larger lifeguard community. And then hitting flow state. So if you've done any reading about or any podcast listening about personal development, you've heard about flow, and you've heard about the flow state, but it's the idea that you get literally in the flow, and you find kind of your rhythm in things where it's not it's not overly taxing where you have to work really, 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 really hard because it's new or it's complicated for you, but it's also not too easy. It's not something that is just mindless for you. It has to keep your attention, and it's that sweet spot of the challenge. So when it comes to gamification, we want to be thinking about how we can turn different activities into games and how we can kind of lean back on those 5 different metrics and those 5 different ideas to be developing what those look like. When it comes to games specifically, you want to be thinking about it being goal driven and having an actual purpose. So, like doing any game is not the same as doing a really designed game that has a really clear point to it. That's not to say that you shouldn't sometimes do different games just because it can promote communication or teamwork or, fun. But that is the reason then that you're doing those things because it's promoting communication, teamwork, or it's fun. And that's valid if that's what the intent is. You also want to make sure that it's active. So as much as possible, active both in participation and engagement and movement and finding a lot of different ways. Active doesn't have to be that they're just like up and down all the time, but it can mean that you're finding different ways to activate them. So activating their brain, their body, and just finding different ways to activate their senses as well. It should be measurable, so finding some ways to measure overall what you're doing, and then it should be engaging. So competition in some capacity, and it has some type of variation to it. So generally, I think of 3 different gamification types, and these are the 3 categories I think they fall into. I think games can be focused on skill building. I think they can be focused on response. And then I think the third one, this wasn't always the area that I was really good at, but I think this is an area that we need to be collectively like really focusing on together is the scanning. So these are the 3 that I think about when we come to gamification. And I think that any game that we create or that we translate into a game that has to do with lifeguarding, like Jeopardy. We turn it into a lifeguarding version of Jeopardy. We should be thinking about which of these 3 pillars it falls into. So when it comes to skills, we're thinking about precision, technique, and then we're just thinking about muscle memory. So thinking about time on task. So things like a CPR rotation, backboard race, moving through like perfect rep. We used to do a lot of small group practices where we would go through activating an EAP and you'd have to start over if you made a mistake in the process at any point. So we would do one thing at a time in kind of this line, and then if the one person got the next step wrong, everybody would have to start over at the beginning again. So it's like a perfect rep challenge. Equipment relay races, pretty straightforward, right? The next one's response. So decision making, speed, teamwork, and communication under pressure. I also would say response isn't just speed in practice. In real life, speed's probably the main metric that we're thinking about when it comes to feedback in this topic, but things like effort and communication in general is also some of the soft skills that we're looking for in response. Obviously, effort in a real life situation isn't going to be measurable, really. Like it can be when it's practice, so that's why I don't have it in here as kind of an end result. But think about scenario-based competitions. Choose your response type of scenario. So moving away from this idea of you have a perfect scenario card and it just says every step by step by step by step, but really opening it up so that your team can work collectively together to say, okay, there's not a pulse, so we're going to do this, and kind of moving through it together. Any type of time response drill where people have different roles. And then distraction drills that you can layer in as well. And then the last type is scanning. So prevention, vigilance, and attention to detail can do things like Where's Waldo, silent scanning competitions, spot the risk of having different hazards as well. And then also any type of audits, I think, can fall into this category that have to do with scanning that you integrate into your actual training portion. I will have a lot more activities in the workbook that we'll send out, but just to give us a high level kind of talk through some of these, here are some game ideas as it relates back to skills. And again, one of the things that I think is really helpful is to also think about what games are classic. Like Uno is obviously a classic game. Operation's been around forever, but what are also some things that are kind of up and coming, and can you learn about them, and then can you translate that into either a skill or a response or a scanning component based on it. Obviously, everyone has at some point done like first aid Jeopardy of some kind, but can you rework that to be a skill-based Jeopardy that isn't just a fact-based Jeopardy? Can you rework it so that you're talking about something else that's related to what you need them to practice, but thinking kind of outside the box? So operation, explaining correct care, sequence solitaire, an error hunt, finding and fixing an incorrect setup, and kind of like a matching situation. Go fish, you can be matching skill steps. Sometimes doing something really mindful, like we're ordering the steps of how something is supposed to go, and then matching that with the physical actual practice can really land if you have people who learn in slightly different capacities, or kind of do best when they can visually see what's going on, and then from there they can physically practice. This used to be the concept that we used to think there were different types of learners. They some of that psychology is kind of debunked now, that they don't think there are different types of learners. They actually just think that different people learn in different environments in different ways. But it's good to be thinking about just different ways of engagement again. Uno, CPR rotation race, and then perfect 10's another example. And I'll send you directions for these in the workbook. So if you're like, how the heck would you do that? I will send you some details. We also have a couple of blog posts on the HydroApps blog with ones like that, with some of these games that are specifically related to first aid, that you could at least see how those are run, and you could rework them for other skills if you wanted. For response games, thinking about capture the flag, war, clue, Monopoly, rapid fire scenarios, and then what changed situations as well, to help them just be able to be resilient and dynamic, and being able to adjust as the situation adjusts, and being able to kind of literally go with the flow when things aren't happening as they might expect. Some people are better just organically at being able to have plans adjust and change. Some people have to work really hard on that type of resilience. And some people, there's adults that all of us know that are still working on that skill. So it's definitely something that's helpful to implement, and then talk about, and then just kind of make people be aware of. And then scanning games. So guess who, spot, risk. Where's Waldo? You can kind of rework that as a search activity. That was in the original overview that I did. Behavior bingo, a 10-second scan recall. So this is one of my favorites. I think this is a great way to implement an audit as well, where you can do this in training, where you have them scan and then you remember what they were actively observing. And then you can also turn that into kind of the foundation of audits that you do with your team. Trivia pursuit, and then everybody's classic favorite, Jeopardy, of course. So what's the big takeaway here? You want to be layering in different components as much as possible. You want to make sure that whatever you're gamifying isn't just in one of those areas. So you're not just focused on skills when you're gamifying, but you're also making sure that you're hitting the ideas around scanning as well, and just making sure that you're diversifying how you're gamifying and training your team as well. You also want to add in different layers, so distractions, making sure that you're adding in those layers of pressure potentially. You have lots going on, and different things are going to be more taxing for more people. I have a really hard time focusing when there's a lot of side conversations going on, especially if I can see the people's mouths. I get really distracted, and so that's really hard for me. But I also, generally I can work really well and focus in a coffee shop, and I can have really loud music on and not be distracted at all. So everyone's a little bit different, and even just finding some different ways to replicate different things will meet a lot of different people where they are. So just bringing it all together, I want us to be thinking about different activities and different ways we can be including things in each of these categories. So with realism, inclusion, and engagement, hopefully you have a couple ideas that you can integrate based on what I talked through. If you do want to share any ideas in the chat, or if you have any ideas that I haven't mentioned in any of these categories, we'd love to have you share that if you're willing. And then just a couple last minute tips to seal this all together and bring us all the way back. When it comes to running effective trainings, you want to be thinking about high turnover, high time on task, which generally is going to be the use of using effective stations and rotating people through different things. So just think about the fact that you want goals and focuses to be really specific and have 1 to 2 per station. You want high repetition and high time on task again. So if there's a lot of time at in-services where people are standing around or just observing, then that means that you either need to have more stations going on and you need more people helping to run the in-services. So there's a lot more practice happening. Or you might need to also get some more equipment so that people, instead of having, a group of 8 and 2 people are working on a mannequin, you have 3 or 4 mannequins at that station and everybody's doing something actively in that rotation. Make sure that your culture is one, you have a collective, culture around making mistakes and having a growth mindset. Make sure that you're coaching directly to people and then having them redo it immediately. So don't let them like hang on to some feedback that you give or give them feedback later in an email. Or let them know they have to attend like some remedial training without giving them opportunity as well to be doing it in the moment as much as possible. Sometimes that's just not the case, but as much as possible, give them coaching immediately and directly, and then have them redo it immediately as well. And then make sure that you're rotating groups efficiently and mindfully. Make sure that you're debriefing with your staff. So this is for a lot of people where like some of that deep learning happens, where you're able to talk through what was difficult. This helps us as people who are running and designing in services also not just think that, we can read into it in the wrong way. Like we might think that the group is not really getting it, maybe because it was challenging and people didn't get it correct. But maybe it was really impactful because people had to think through it. And you might be able to get that information during a debrief by asking questions like what felt the hardest, where did you feel like you had missed some of the process, where did you feel stressed, what helped you stay calm. They're going to give you such impactful and wonderful insights that it would really be a bummer to miss out on some of that and hear back from them, especially because I think the longer we do this, the more we kind of decide in our brains that, if a training has been successful or not. And that might not always be the case. So especially if you're more seasoned, I really invite you to have these conversations with your team and then ask them what you would do differently and get that feedback. And just remember too that the suggestions they give might be something that you tried 5 or 10 years ago and it didn't work, but we're in a different time now, 5 or 10 years later, and you're a different version of yourself. Your teams are different. The situation's different. The environment's different, and it might be worth it to try some of those things again. When it comes to engagement, I also think it's important that coaching and auditing is a huge part of your process. So making sure that you have on-site scanning evaluations, recognition timing checks, behavior-based feedback, catch them doing a great job, catch them doing things well. Don't constantly be just punitive in how you are trying to get them to do on evaluations and performance evals and audits, but don't be afraid to have performance plans as well and have those built in. So I think one of the things that's the hardest about engaging our team at times is that we might have different levels of learners and different levels of skills even on our lifeguard team. We might have people that have done it over and over and over again, and they really need some exciting little things to keep them fresh because otherwise they're just like, this is pointless. I know how to do this. This is my 8th summer here. And then you have some people that it's like year 1 or 2 and you have different skill levels. So don't be afraid to have those stations and make sure you're mindful of who's at those stations so that you can bring some people up and also empower those that have been there for a long time to step into that role of teacher in a little, if it's appropriate in some of those instances. But then also don't be afraid to have improvement plans so that way you can make sure that you're addressing any of the outliers that might be bringing the quality of the instruction in a different realm than you want it to. And don't be afraid to identify individual gaps based on that, provide them with feedback, and then create plans for them. I find that if you don't have a plan for this stuff, it's really hard to make it happen in the moment because you're just so busy with so many other things. It just feels like an undoable task. So just a couple things as we wrap up. In services to keep them engaging and interesting, I also think that we need to kind of balance the idea of hard skills with soft skills. So hard skills are, all of the stuff that we've been talking about as it fits into one of those gamification buckets, actual skills, and then the actual hard skill of scanning and responding. But we also, have a lot of opportunity to teach our team about soft skills. And I think this is the layer that we add on when it comes to being able to not only make sure that they're good lifeguards, which is the hard skill, but make sure that they're good humans that are lifeguards, which is the soft skill. It's really the experience around the rescue. And we've all been in situations where we have felt like someone maybe was really good at their profession and they were a hard skill, but we missed something on the soft skill side. I think the most common example that we hear about this kind of in culture is like bedside manner with doctors. Like they might be a really effective doctor, but there is some stuff missing on the soft skill side. So just making sure that your team knows this, and this is some of the most rewarding stuff. This like really roots it also back to the why. So even if they don't intend to do anything that's related to first responding or the medical industry or anything like that, they will do all this stuff. They'll have to interact with people regardless of what job they do. They'll have to communicate. They'll have to adjust their approach. They'll have to manage situations. They'll have to manage their own emotions. They'll have to be aware of their own bias and their identity. And so if all you can tie it back to is the soft skills, that at least is something you can still tie it back to, and you can still ground the importance of training for them and with them. So our team need repetition, feedback, real scenarios, and then they need a safe place to fail. So if that's not training, then it's probably not engaging them either, because it's feeling like they either need to be performing perfectly, or if they feel like you're not helping other people who are failing and they don't feel safe, then that's obviously the other end of the spectrum too. And then just some reflection questions for us as a group. What's one thing that we can think about changing for our own in-services? What feels the hardest about this? What do you think your staff would really love and appreciate? And then if you have any comments and you want to jump in on any of this stuff, what else are you doing that's really awesome and mindful for our group that you think would be helpful to share as well? Feel free to jump in the comments. Just some key takeaways as we wrap up here, and if there are any comments, I'll read those, of course. But for key takeaways, train for chaos, not for perfection. Emotional training is skill training, so don't forget that component. Inclusion improves outcomes. Engagement drives that consistency, and then repetition can build confidence. So I am happy to stay on and answer any questions before we wrap up, but I do want to give everybody some follow-up information. So if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint that I have gone through and you want the slides, grab my email here, kateconnell@hydroapps.com, and I will send you the PowerPoint. And then everyone that has signed up will get a recording to the recorded version of the webinar and the workbook that we're going to send out. So we'll send you some additional information about that as well. See here if we have any questions. And I don't see any. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and wrap up. And like I said, we'll send all of this information out. I do invite you to shoot me a note if I can be of help at all. If there's once we send out the workbook, if there's any games that you have some questions about, or if there's any questions you have about skill building, about scanning, repetition, or of course about how HydroApps can help you keep track of your trainings, please let me know and I'll put you in touch with some resources. We have blog posts, we have additional webinars, and we have some additional resources for you. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you got at least one little nugget you can take back and implement right away. And I hope you all have a safe and successful summer and your team is interested and they're engaged. And hopefully for you all, you're also feeling motivated and you're also feeling a little bit inspired as you head into the busy season and start putting these trainings together and leading these trainings for your team. Thank you all so much and have a great summer.